The fourth day, Wednesday, May 31st, 1944. Chapter 17. In the middle of the night, the roads of southern England were thronged with traffic. Great convoys of army trucks rumbled along every highway, roaring through the darkened towns, heading for the coast. Bemused villagers stood at their bedroom windows, staring in incredulity at the endless stream of traffic that was stealing their sleep. "My God," said Greta, "there really is going to be an invasion." She and Flick had left London shortly after midnight in a borrowed car, a big white Lincoln Continental that Flick loved to drive. Greta wore one of her less eye-popping outfits, a simple black dress with a brunette rig. She would not be Gerard again until the mission was over. Flick hoped Greta was as expert as Mark had claimed. She worked for the General Post Office as an engineer, so presumably she knew what she was talking about. But Flick had not been able to test her. Now as they crawled along behind a tank transporter, Flick explained the mission, anxiously hoping the conversation would not reveal gaps in Greta's knowledge. The chateau contains a new automatic exchange put in by the Germans to handle all the extra telephone and teleprinter traffic between Berlin and the occupying forces. At first, Greta was skeptical about the plan. "But sweetheart, even if we succeed, what's to stop the Germans just rerouting calls around the network? Volume of traffic. The system is overloaded. The Army's command center called Zeppelin outside Berlin handles 120,000 long-distance calls and 20,000 telex messages a day. There will be more when we invade France, but much of the French system still consists of manual exchanges. Now imagine that the main automatic exchange is out of service, and all those calls have to be made the old-fashioned way, by hello girls, taking 10 times as long. 90% of them will never get through. The military could prohibit civilian calls. That won't make much difference. Civilian traffic is only a tiny fraction anyway." "All right," Greta was thoughtful. "Well, we could destroy the common equipment racks." "What do they do?" "Provide the tones and ringing voltages, and so on for automatic calls. And the registered translators, they transform the dialed area code into a routing instruction." "Would that make the whole exchange unworkable?" "No, and the damage could be repaired. You need to knock out the manual exchange, the automatic exchange, the long-distance amplifiers, the telex exchange, and the telex amplifiers, which are probably all in different rooms. Remember, we can't carry a great quantity of explosives with us. Only what 6 women could hide in their everyday bags. That's a problem." Michael had been through all this with Arnaud, a member of the Bollinger Circuit, who worked for the French PTT. Posters, telegraphs, telephones, but Flick had not carried the details, and Arnaud was dead, killed in the raid. There must be some equipment common to all the systems. Yes, there is. The MDF. What's that? The main distribution frame. 2 sets of terminals on large racks. All the cables from outside come to one side of the frame. All the cables from the exchange comes to the other end. They are connected by jumper links. Where would that be? In a room next to the cable chamber. Ideally, you'd want a fire hot enough to melt the copper in the cables. How long would it take to reconnect the cables? A couple of days. Are you sure? When the cables in my street were severed by a bomb, one old post office engineer had us reconnected in a few hours. Street repairs are simple, just a matter of connecting broken ends together, red to red and blue to blue. But an MDF has hundreds of cross connections. 2 days is conservative, and that assumes that the repairmen have the record cards. Record cards? They show how the cables are connected. They are normally kept in a cabinet in the MDF room. If we burn them too, it will take weeks of trial and error to figure out the connections. Now recalled Michael saying the Resistance had someone in the PTT who was ready to destroy the duplicate records kept at headquarters. This is sounding good. Now listen, in the morning, when I explain our mission to the others, I'm going to tell them something completely different, a cover story. Why? So that our mission won't be jeopardized if one of us is captured and interrogated. Oh, Greta found this a sobering thought. How dreadful. You're the only one who knows the true story, so keep it to yourself for now. Don't worry. Us careers are used to keeping secrets. Flick was startled by her choice of words, but made no comment. The finishing school was located on the grounds of one of England's grandest stately homes. Beaulieu, pronounced Bewley, was a sprawling estate in the New Forest near the south coast. The main residence, Palace House, was the home of Lord Montague. Hidden away in the surrounding woods were numerous large country houses and extensive grounds of their own. Most of these had been vacated early in the war. Younger owners had gone on active service, and older ones generally had the means to flee to safer locations. 12 of the houses had been requisitioned by SOE and were used for training agents in security, wireless operation, map reading, and dirtier skills, such as burglary, sabotage, forgery, and silent killing. They reached the place at 3 o'clock in the morning. Flick drove down a rough track and crossed the cattle grid before pulling up in front of a large house. Coming here always felt like entering a fantasy world, one where deception and violence were talked of as commonplace. The house had an appropriate air of unreality. Although it had about 20 bedrooms, it was built in the style of a cottage, an architectural affectation that had been popular in the years before the First World War. It looked quaint in the moonlight, with its chimneys and dormer windows, hipped roofs, and tile-hung bays. It was like an illustration in a children's novel. A big, rambling house where you could play hide and seek all day. The place was silent. The rest of the team was here, Flick knew, but they would be asleep. She was familiar with the house and found 2 vacant rooms on the attic floor. She and Greta went gratefully to bed. Flick lay awake for a while, wondering how she would ever weld this bunch of misfits into a fighting unit. But she soon fell asleep. She got up again at 6. From her window, she could see the estuary of the Solent. The water looked like mercury in the gray morning light. She boiled a kettle for shaving and took it to Greta's room. Then she roused the others. Percy and Paul were first to arrive in the big kitchen at the back of the house. Percy demanding tea and Paul coffee. Flick told them to make it themselves. She had not joined SOE to wait on men. "I make tea for you sometimes," Percy said indignantly. "You do it with an air of noblesse. Oblige," she replied, like a duke holding a door for a housemaid. Paul laughed. "You guys," he said, "you crack me up." An army cook arrived at 6:30, and before long they were sitting around the big table eating fried eggs and thick rashers of bacon. Food was not rationed for secret agents. They needed to build up their reserves. Once they went into action, they might have to go for days without proper nourishment. The girls came down one by one. Flick was startled by her first sight of Maud Valentine. Neither Percy nor Paul had said how pretty she was. She appeared immaculately dressed and scented, her rosebud mouth accentuated by bright lipstick, looking as if she were off to lunch at the Savoy. She sat next to Paul and said with a suggestive air, "Sleep well, Major." Flick was relieved to see the dark pirate face of Ruby remain. She would not have been surprised to learn that Ruby had run off in the night, never to be seen again. Of course, Ruby could then be rearrested for the murder. She had not been pardoned. Rather, the charges had been dropped. They could always be picked up again. They ought to keep Ruby from disappearing. But she was as tough as a boot, and she might have decided to take the chance. Jelly Knight looked her age. This early in the morning, she sat beside Percy and gave him a fond smile. "I suppose you slept like a top," she said. "Clear conscience," he replied. She laughed. "You haven't got a bloody conscience." The cook offered her a plate of bacon and eggs, but she made a face. "No, thank you, dear," she said. "I've got to wash my figure." Her breakfast was a cup of tea and several cigarettes. When Greta came through the door, Flick held her breath. She wore a pretty cotton dress with a small false bosom. A pink cardigan softened her shoulder line, and a chiffon scarf concealed her masculine throat. She wore the short duck wig. Her face was heavily powdered, but she had used only a little lipstick and eye makeup. By contrast with her sassy onstage personality, today she was playing the part of a rather plain young woman who was perhaps a little embarrassed about being so tall. Flick introduced her and watched the reactions of the other woman. This was the first test of Greta's impersonation. They all smiled pleasantly, showing no sign that they saw anything wrong, and Flick breathed easier. Along with Maud, the other woman Flick had not met before was Lady Denise Boyer. Percy had interviewed her at Hendon and had recruited her despite signs that she was indiscreet. She turned out to be a plain girl with a lot of dark hair and a defiant ear. Although she was the daughter of a marquis, she lacked the easy self-confidence typical of upper-class girls. Flick felt a little sorry for her, but Denise was too charmless to be likable. This is my team, Flick thought. One flirt, one murderess, one safe-breaker, one female impersonator, and one awkward aristocrat. There was someone missing, she realized. The other aristocrat, Diana, had not appeared, and it was now 7:30. Flick said to Percy, "You did tell Diana that Riviere was at 6. I told everyone, and I banged on her door at a 1:15. Flick stood up. I'd better check on her bedroom. 10, right?" She went upstairs and knocked at Diana's door. There was no response, so she went in. The room looked as if a bomb had hit it. A suitcase open on the rumpled bed, pillows on the floor, knickers on the dressing table. But Flick knew this was normal. Diana had always been surrounded by people whose job it was to tidy up after her. Flick's mother had been one of those people. No, Diana had simply gone off somewhere. She was going to have to realize that her time was no longer her own. Flick thought with irritation. She's disappeared. She told the others. We'll start without her. She stood at the head of the table. We have 2 days training in front of us. Then on Friday night, we parachute into France. We're an all-female team because it is much easier for women to move around occupied France. The Gestapo are less suspicious. Our mission is to blow up a railway tunnel near the village of Mars, not far from Reims, on the main railway line between Frankfurt and Paris. Flick glanced at Greta, who knew the story was false. She sat quietly, buttering toast, and did not meet Flick's eyes. The agent's course is normally 3 months, Flick went on, but this tunnel has to be destroyed by Monday night. In 2 days, we hope to give you some basic security rules, teach you how to parachute, do some weapons training, and show you how to kill people without making a noise. Marta looked pale despite her makeup. Kill people, she said. Surely you don't expect girls to do that. Shelley gave a grunt of disgust. There is a bloody war on, you know. Diana came in from the garden with bits of vegetation clinging to her corduroy trousers. I've been for a tramp in the woods, she said enthusiastically. Marvelous, and look what the greenhouseman gave me. She took a handful of ripe tomatoes from her pocket and rolled them onto the kitchen table. Flick said, Sit down, Diana. You're late for the briefing. I'm sorry, darling. Have I missed your lovely talk? You're in the military now, Flick said. with exasperation. "When you're told to be in the kitchen by 7, it's not a suggestion. You're not going to get all headmistressy with me, are you? Sit down and shut up." "Frightfully sorry, darling." Flick raised her voice. "Diana, when I say shut up, you don't say frightfully sorry to me. And you don't call me darling ever. Just shut up." Diana sat down in silence, but she looked mutinous. "Oh, hell," Flick thought. "I didn't handle that very well." The kitchen door opened with a bang, and a small, muscular man of about 40 came in. He had sergeant's chevrons on his uniform shirt. "Good morning, girls," he said heartily. Flick said, "This is Sergeant Bill Griffiths, one of the instructors." She did not like Bill, an Army PT instructor. He showed an unpleasant relish in physical combat, and never seemed sorry enough when he hurt someone. She had noticed that he was worse with women. "We're just about ready for you, Sergeant, so why don't you begin?" She moved aside and leaned against the wall. "Your wish is my command," he said, unnecessarily. He took her place at the head of the table. "Landing with a parachute," he began. "It's like jumping off a wall 14 feet high. The ceiling of this kitchen is a bit less than that, so it's like leaping into the garden from upstairs." Flick heard Jelly said quietly, "Oh my Gordon." "You cannot come down on your feet and stay upright," Bill continued. "If you try to land in a standing position, you will break your legs. The only safe way is to fall. So the first thing we're going to teach you is how to fall. If anyone wishes to keep their clothing clean, please go into the boot room just there and put on overalls. If you will assemble outside in 3 minutes, we will begin." While the women were changing, Paul took his leave. "We need a parachute training flight tomorrow, and they're going to tell me there are no planes available," he said to Flick. "I'm going to London to kick ass. I'll be back tonight." Flick wondered if he was going to see his girl as well. In the garden were an old pine table, an ugly mahogany wardrobe from the Victorian era, and a stepladder 14 feet high. Jelly was dismayed. "You're not going to make us jump off the top of that bloody wardrobe, are you?" she said to Flick. "Not before we show you how," she said. "You'll be surprised how easy it is." Jelly looked at Percy. "You bugger," she said. "What have you let me in for?" When they were all ready, Bill said, "First we are going to learn to fall from 0 height. There are 3 ways: forward, backwards, and sideways." He demonstrated each method, dropping to the ground effortlessly and springing up again with a gymnastic's agility. "You must keep your legs together." He looked awk and added, "as all the young ladies should." No one laughed. "Do not throw out your arms to break your fall, but keep them at your sides. Do not worry about hurting yourself. If you break an arm, it will hurt a hell of a lot worse." As Flick expected, the younger girls had no difficulty. Diana, Maud, Ruby, and Denise were all able to fall like athletes as soon as they were shown how. Ruby, having done it once from the standing position, lost patience with the exercise. She climbed to the top of the stepladder. "Not yet," Bill shouted at her. but he was too late. She jumped off the top and landed perfectly. Then she walked off, sat under a tree, and lit a cigarette. I think she is going to give me trouble, Flick thought. Flick was more worried about Jelly. She was a key member of the team, the only one who knew about explosives. But she had lost her girlish suppleness some years ago. Parachuting was going to be difficult for her. However, she was game. Falling from the standing position, she hit the ground with a grunt and cussed as she got up, but she was ready to try again. To Flick's surprise, the worst student was Greta. "I can't do this," she said to Flick. "I told you I'm no good at rough stuff." It was the first time Greta had spoken more than a couple of words, and Jelly frowned and muttered, "Funny accent." "Let me help you," Bill said to Greta. "Stand still. Just relax." He took her by the shoulders. Then, with a sudden strong motion, he threw her to the ground. She landed heavily and gave a gasp of pain. She struggled to her feet and, to Flick's dismay, she began to cry. "For God's sake," Bill said disgustedly, "what kind of people are they sending us?" Flick glared at him. She did not want to lose her telephone engineer through Bill's brutishness. "Just go easy," she snapped at him. He was unrepentant. "The Gestapo are a lot worse than me." Flick would have to mend the damage herself. She took Greta by the hand. "We'll do a little special training on our own." They went around the house to another part of the garden. "I'm sorry," Greta said. "I just hate that little man." "I know. Now let's do this together. Kneel down." They knelt, facing one another, and held hands. "Just do what I do." Flick leaned slowly sideways. Greta mirrored her action. Together they fell to the ground, still holding hands. "There," Flick said. "That was all right, wasn't it?" Greta smiled. "Why can't he be like you?" Flick shrugged. "Men," she said with a grin. "Now are you ready to try falling from a standing position? We'll do it the same way, holding hands." She took Greta through all the exercises Bill was doing with the others. Greta quickly gained confidence. They returned to the group. The others were jumping off the table. Greta joined in and landed perfectly, and they gave her a round of applause. They progressed to jumping from the top of the wardrobe, then finally the stepladder. When Jelly jumped off the ladder, rolled perfectly, and stood upright, Flick hugged her. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Well done." Bill looked disgusted. He turned to Percy. "What the hell kind of army is it when you get a hug for doing what you're bloody well told?" "Get used to it, Bill," said Percy. Chapter 18. At the tall house in the Rue du Bois, Dieter carried Stephanie's suitcase up the stairs and into Mademoiselle Limes's bedroom. He looked at the tightly made single bed, the old-fashioned walnut chest of drawers, and the prayer stool with a rosary on its lectern. "It's not going to be easy to pretend this is your house," he said anxiously, putting the case on the bed. "I'll say I've inherited it from a maiden aunt, and I've been too lazy to fix it up to my taste," she said. "Clever. All the same, you'll need to mess it up a little." She opened the case, took out a black negligee, and draped it carelessly over the prayer stool. "Better already," Deirdre said. "What will you do if the phone rings?" Stephanie thought for a minute. When she spoke, her voice was lower, and her high-class Paris accent had been replaced by the tones of provincial gentility. "Hello, yes, this is Mademoiselle Limes. Who is calling, please?" "Very good," said Deirdre. The impersonation might not fool a close friend or relative, but a casual caller would notice nothing wrong, especially with the distortion of the telephone line. They explored the house. There were 4 more bedrooms, each ready to receive a guest. The beds made up a clean towel on each washstand. In the kitchen, where there should have been a selection of small saucepans and a 1-cup coffee pot, they found large casserole dishes and a sack of rice that would have fed Mademoiselle Limes for a year. The wine in the cellar was cheap, vin ordinaire, but there was half a case of good Scotch whisky. The garage at the side of the house contained a little pre-war Simca sink, the French version of the Fiat the Italians called the Topolino. It was in good condition, with a tank full of petrol. He cranked the starting handle, and the engine turned over immediately. There was no way the authorities would have allowed Mademoiselle Limes to buy scarce petrol and spare parts for a car to take her shopping. The vehicle must have been fueled and maintained by the resistance. He wondered what cover story she had used to explain her ability to drive around. Perhaps she pretended to be a midwife. The old cow was well organized, Deirdre remarked. Stephanie made lunch. They had shopped on the way. There was no meat or fish in the shops, but they had bought some mushrooms and lettuce and a loaf of pain noir, the bread the French bakers made with the poor flour and bran, which was all they could get. Stephanie prepared a salad and used the mushrooms to make a risotto, and they found some cheese in the larder to finish off. With crumbs on the dining room table and dirty pans in the kitchen sink, the house began to look more lived in. "The war must have been the best thing that ever happened to her," Deirdre said as they drank coffee. "How can you say that? She's on her way to a prison camp. Think of the life she led before. A woman alone, no husband, no family, her parents dead. Then into her life come all these young people, brave boys and girls, on daredevil missions. They probably tell her all about their loves and their fears. She hides them in her house, gives them whiskey and cigarettes, and sends them on their way, wishing them luck. It was probably the most exciting time of her life. I bet she's never been so happy. Perhaps she would have preferred a peaceful life, shopping for hats with a woman friend, arranging the flowers for the cathedral, going to Paris once a year for a concert. Nobody really prefers a peaceful life." Deirdre glanced out of the dining room window. Damn! A young woman was coming up the path, pushing a bicycle with a large basket over its front wheel. "Who the hell is this?" Stephanie stared at the approaching visitor. What shall I do? Dieter did not answer for a moment. The intruder was a plain, fit-looking girl in muddy trousers and a work shirt with big sweat patches under the armpits. She did not ring the doorbell, but pushed her bicycle into the courtyard. He was dismayed. Was its charade to be exposed so soon? She's coming to the back door. She must be a friend or relation. You'll just have to improvise. Go and meet her. I'll stay here and listen. They heard the kitchen door open and closed, and the girl called out in French, "Good morning, it's me." Stephanie went into the kitchen. Dieter stood by the dining room door. He could hear everything clearly. The girl's startled voice said, "Who are you?" "I'm Stephanie, the niece of Mademoiselle Lemus." The visitor did not bother to conceal her suspicion. "I didn't know she had a niece. She didn't tell me about you either." Dieter heard the note of amiable amusement in Stephanie's voice, and realized she was being charming. "Would you like to sit down? What's in that basket?" "Some provisions. I'm Mary. I live in the country. I'm able to get extra food, and I bring some for Mademoiselle." "Ah," said Stephanie, "for her guests." There was a rustling sound, and Dieter guessed Stephanie was looking through the paper-wrapped food in the basket. "This is wonderful. Eggs, pork, strawberries." This explained how Mademoiselle Lemus managed to remain plump, Dieter thought. "You know, then?" said Mary. "I know about Auntie's secret life, yes." Hearing her say Auntie, Dieter realized that neither he nor Stephanie had ever asked Mademoiselle Lemus' first name. The pretense would be over if Mary found out that Stephanie did not even know the name of her aunt. "Where is she?" "She went to Aix. Do you remember Charles Minton, who used to be dean at the cathedral?" "No, I don't." "Perhaps you're too young. He was the best friend of Auntie's father, until he retired and went to live in Provence." Stephanie was improvising brilliantly. Dieter thought with admiration. She had cool nerves, and she was imaginative. "He has suffered a heart attack, and she has gone to nurse him. She asked me to take care of any guests while she's away." "When will she come back?" "Charles is not expected to live long. On the other hand, the war may be over soon. She didn't tell anyone about this Charles. She told me." It looked as if Stephanie might get away with it. Deirdre thought if she could keep this up a little longer, Mary would go away convinced. She would report what had happened to someone or other. But Stephanie's story was plausible, and exactly the kind of thing that happened in resistance movements. It was not like the army. Someone like Mademoiselle Lemus could easily make a unilateral decision to leave her post and put someone else in charge. It drove resistance leaders mad, but there was nothing they could do. All their troops were volunteers. He began to feel hopeful. "Where are you from?" said Mary. "I live in Paris." "Does your Aunt Valerie have any other nieces hidden away?" So Deirdre thought Mademoiselle Lima's name is Valerie. I don't think so. None that I know. You're a liar. Mary's tone had changed. Something had gone wrong. Deirdre sighed and drew the automatic pistol from beneath his jacket. Stephanie said, "What on earth are you talking about? You're lying. You don't even know her name. It's not Valerie. It's Jeanne. Deirdre thumbed the safety lever on the left of the slide up to the fire position. Stephanie carried on gamely. I always call her Auntie. You're being very rude. Mary said scornfully, I knew from the start Jeanne would never trust someone like you, with your high heels and perfume. Deirdre stepped into the kitchen. What a shame, Mary, he said. If you had been more trusting or less clever, you might have got away. As it is, you're under arrest. Mary looked at Stephanie and said, You're a Gestapo whore. It was a wounding jibe, and Stephanie blushed. Deirdre was so infuriated that he almost pistol-whipped Mary. You'll regret that remark when you're in the hands of the Gestapo, he said coldly. There's a man called Sergeant Becker who's going to question you. When you're screaming and bleeding and begging for mercy, remember that careless insult. Mary looked poised to flee. Deirdre almost hoped she would. Then he could shoot her, and the problem would be solved. But she did not run. After a long moment, her shoulders slumped and she began to cry. Her tears did not move him. Lie face down on the floor with your hands behind your back. She obeyed. He put away the gun. I think I saw a rope in the cellar, he said to Stephanie. I'll get it. She returned with a length of washing line. Deirdre tied Mary's hands and feet. I'll have to take her to Santa Cecile, he said. We can't have her here in case of British agents comes in today. He looked at his watch. It was 2:00. He had time to take her to the chateau and be back by 3. You'll have to go to the crypt on your own, he told Stephanie. Use the little car in the garage. I'll be in the cathedral, though you may not see me. He kissed her, almost like a husband going to the office, he thought with grim amusement. He picked Mary up and slung her over his shoulder. I'll have to hurry, he said, and went to the back door. He stepped outside, then turned back. Hide the bicycle. Don't worry, Stephanie replied. He carried the bound girl through the courtyard and into the street. He opened the trunk of his car and put her inside. Had it not been for the whore comment, he would have put her on the back seat. He slammed the lid and looked around. He saw no one. But there were always watchers in a street such as this, peering through their shutters. They would have seen Mademoiselle Limas being taken away yesterday, and would have remarked the big sky blue car. As soon as he drove away, they would be talking about the man who had put a girl into the trunk of his car. In normal times, they would have called the police, but no one in occupied territory would talk to the police unless they had to, especially where the Gestapo might be involved. The key question for Dieter was, would the resistance hear of the arrest of Mademoiselle Limas? Reims was a city, not a village. People were arrested every day. Thieves, murderers, smugglers, black marketeers, communists, Jews. There was a good chance that no report of the events in the Rue de Bois would reach the ears of Michel Clariette. But there was no guarantee. Dieter got into the car and headed for Saint-Cécile. Chapter 19. The team had got through the morning's instruction reasonably well. To Flick's relief, everyone had learned the falling technique, which was the hardest part of parachuting. The map reading session had been less successful. Ruby had never been to school and could barely read. A map was like a page of Chinese to her. Maud was baffled by directions such as north, northeast, and fluttered her eyelids prettily at the instructor. Denise, despite her expensive education, proved completely incapable of understanding coordinates. If the group got split up in France, Flick thought worriedly she would not be able to rely on them finding their own way. In the afternoon, they moved on to the rough stuff. The weapons instructor was Captain Jim Cardwell, a character quite different from Bill Griffiths. Jim was an easy-going man with a craggy face and a thick black mustache. He grinned amiably when the girls discovered how difficult it was to hit a tree at 6 paces with a .45 caliber Colt automatic pistol. Ruby was comfortable with an automatic in her hand and could shoot accurately. Flick suspected she had used handguns before. Ruby was even more comfortable when Jim put his arms around her to show her how to hold the Lee Enfield Canadian rifle. He murmured something in her ear, and she smiled up at him, with a wicked gleam in her black eyes. She had been in a woman's prison for 3 months. Flick reflected. No doubt she was enjoying being touched by a man. Jelly, too, handled the firearms with relaxed familiarity, but Diana was the star of the session. Using the rifle, she hit the center of the target with every shot, emptying the magazine of both its 5-round clips in a steady burst of deadly fire. "Very good," Jim said in surprise. "You can have my job." Diana looked triumphantly at Flick. "There are some things you're not best at," she said. "What the heck did I do to deserve that?" Flick asked herself. Was Diana thinking of that thinking of their school days, when Flick had always done so much better? Did the childhood rivalry still rankle? Greta was the only failure. Once again, she was more feminine than the real woman. She put her hands over her ears, jumped nervously at every bang, and closed her eyes in terror as she pulled the trigger. Jim worked with her patiently, giving her earplugs to muffle the noise, holding her hand to teach her how to squeeze the trigger gently. But it was no good. She was too skittish ever to be a good shot. I'm just not cut out for this kind of thing, she said in despair. Jelly said, Then what the hell are you doing here? Flick interposed quickly. Greta's an engineer. She's going to tell you where to place the charges. Why do we need a German engineer? I'm English, Greta said. My father was born in Liverpool. Jelly snorted skeptically. If that's a Liverpool accent, I'm the Duchess of Devonshire. Save your aggression for the next session, Flick said. We're about to do hand-to-hand combat. This bickering bothered her. She needed them to trust one another. They returned to the garden of the house, where Bill Griffiths was waiting. He had changed into shorts and tennis shoes, and was doing push-ups on the grass with his shirt off. When he stood up, Flick got the feeling he wanted them to admire his physique. Bill liked to teach self-defense by giving the student a weapon and saying, "Attack me." Then he would demonstrate how an unarmed man could repel an attacker. It was a dramatic and memorable lesson. Bill was sometimes unnecessarily violent, but Flick always thought the agents might as well get used to that. Today he had a selection of weapons laid out on the old pine table. A wicked-looking knife that he claimed was SS equipment, a Walther P-38 automatic pistol of the kind Flick had seen German officers carrying a French policeman's truncheon, a length of black and yellow electrical cord that he called a garrote, and a beer bottle with a neck snapped to leave a rough circle of sharp glass. He put his shirt back on for the training session. "How to escape from a man who is pointing a gun at you," he began. He picked up the Walther, thumbed the safety catch up to the firing position, and handed the gun to Maud. She pointed it at him. "Sooner or later, your captor is going to want you to go somewhere." He turned and put his hands in the air. "Chances are he'll follow close behind you, poking the gun in your back." He walked around in a wide circle with Maud behind. "Now, Maud, I want you to pull the trigger the moment you think I'm trying to escape." He quickened his pace slightly, forcing Maud to step out a little faster to keep up with him. And as she did so, he moved sideways and back. He caught her right wrist under his arm and hit her hand with a sharp, downward chopping motion. She cried out and dropped the gun. "This is where you can make a bad mistake," he said, as Maud rubbed her wrist. "Do not run away at this point, otherwise your corrupt copper will just pick up his gun and shoot you in the back. What you have to do is..." He picked up the lugger, pointed at Maud, and pulled the trigger. There was a bang. Maud screamed, and so did Greta. "This gun is loaded with blanks, of course," Bill said. Sometimes Flick wished Bill would not be quite so dramatic in his demonstrations. "We'll practice all these techniques on one another in a few minutes." He was on. He picked up the electrical cord and turned to Greta. "Put that around my neck. When I give the word, pull it as tight as you can." He handed her the cord. "Your Gestapo man, or your treacherous collaborationists. French gendarme could kill you with the cord, but he can't hold your right with it." "All right, Greta, strangled me. All right, Greta, strangle me." Greta hesitated, then pulled the cord tight. It dug into Bill's muscular neck. He kicked out forward with both feet and fell to the ground, landing on his back. Greta lost her grip on the cord. "Unfortunately," Bill said, "this leaves you lying on the ground with your enemy standing over you, which is an unfavorable situation." He got up. "We'll do it again, but this time, before I drop to the ground, I'm going to take hold of my captor by one wrist." They resumed the position, and Greta pulled the cord tight. Bill grabbed her wrist, fell to the ground, pulling her forward and down. As she fell on top of him, he bent one leg and kneed her viciously in the stomach. She rolled off him and curled up, gasping for breath, and retching Flick said, "For Christ's sake, Bill, that's a bit rough." He looked pleased. "The Gestapo are a lot worse than me," he said. She went to Greta and helped her up. "I'm sorry," she said. "He's a bloody fucking Nazi," Greta gasped. Flick helped Greta into the house and sat her down in the kitchen. The cook, who was peeling potatoes for lunch, offered her a cup of tea, and Greta accepted gratefully. When Flick returned to the garden, Bill had picked his next victim, Ruby, and handed her the policeman's truncheon. There was a cunning look on Ruby's face, and Flick thought, "If I were Bill, I'd be careful with her." Flick had seen Bill demonstrate this technique before. When Ruby raised her right hand to hit him with a truncheon, Bill was going to grab her arm, turn and throw her over his shoulder. She would land flat on her back with a painful thump. "Right, gypsy girl," Bill said. "Hit me with the truncheon as hard as you like." Ruby lifted her arm and Bill moved toward her, but the action did not follow the usual pattern. When Bill reached for Ruby's arm, it was not there. The truncheon fell to the ground. Ruby moved close to Bill and brought her knee up hard into his groin. He gave a sharp cry of pain. She grabbed his shirt front, pulled him toward her sharply, and butted his nose. Then with her sturdy black lace shoe, she kicked his shin, and he fell to the ground, blood pouring from his nose. "You bitch, you weren't supposed to do that," he yelled. "The Gestapo are a lot worse than me," said Ruby.